Every day, you click an absurd number of buttons on the computer. This experience is so pervasive that a lot of the times you don't even realize these occurrences. Yet, in this video, I want to explain why the visual traits of a button, like transparency, can increase your desire for performing this intended action. But first, why do buttons matter? From a rational standpoint, the visual design of a button is completely irrelevant to its intended action. So why does the visual design increase our desire for performing that action? Well, buttons are symbolic representations of that action. Whenever you see a button, you simulate that action. And more importantly, the visual traits of that button can creep into and play a role in the simulation that you run. So here's an example. I have a YouTube video about hidden cues in Amazon that influence our buying behavior. And in that video, I mentioned that Amazon adds more visual space in your shopping cart to make this item seem visually smaller. And because this item seems visually smaller, when you construct your simulation of the purchase, you're injecting the concept of small into that simulation. Therefore, you perceive the purchase to be smaller. You can refer to that video or my book, The Tangled Mind, for exactly why that happens. But for our purposes, the same effect happens with buttons. Whenever you see a button, like a purchase button, the visual size of that button will influence your simulation of that intended action, in this case, that purchase. And when that button is visually smaller, you perceive the purchase to be smaller. So a lot of marketers like to use obnoxiously big buttons to try to capture attention. But this is actually counterproductive because it makes people perceive the purchase to be larger. And visual size is just one trait. There are many other traits of a button that will influence the simulation that you run. So I used to do consulting, and I kind of felt like an idiot sometimes. I would recommend to the client that they use a button with a vivid color so that it would have high visual contrast on the page, and the client would come back to me and say, oh, well, this transparent button worked better. And then I'm just kind of left shrugging my shoulders. It took me a while, but I think I finally understand why that effect is happening. So there are two things going on here. The first reason involves a concept that I sometimes refer to as action simulation. In my last video, I mentioned that Apple places the payment window and purchase button closer to the bottom because this location is closer to the user's fingers, so users can envision themselves pushing that purchase button more easily. I also mentioned that Amazon places graphics and words near the purchase button that prime the motor action of clicking because that priming also gets you to simulate clicking that purchase button more easily. Well, a similar effect happens with transparency. You can increase the simulation of clicking a button and thereby the desire of clicking that button by tweaking the visual traits of that button. In one study, right-handed people preferred a mug when the handle was on the right, yet left-handed people preferred that mug when the handle was on the left. In both cases, people preferred the orientation in which they could simulate reaching out and grasping that handle. Interestingly, the effect disappeared for both groups when both groups were holding something, because when they were holding something, neither group could simulate the interaction of reaching out and grabbing the handle. With transparent buttons, the empty space creates what's called an affordance. Because of that empty space, people can simulate themselves pushing their fingers into that empty space. And this heightens and strengthens the vividness of their simulation, which increases their desire to click that button. So that's one reason behind transparent buttons, but there's also another reason. Earlier in this video, I mentioned that smaller buttons are more motivating because we misattribute that smaller visual size with a smaller abstract size of that task, which is more motivating to us. But transparency shares a hidden connection with that visual size. In my YouTube video called Do You Have Synesthesia, I explained that when asked to choose which is brighter, a sneeze or a cough, the vast majority of people say sneezing. We intuitively associate brightness and sneezing because of a series of hidden intermediary steps. Bright objects are visually lighter objects seem physiologically lighter objects are typically smaller, and smaller objects by nature have a higher pitched sound. Well, those connections also explain why transparent buttons are more effective. Bright objects are visually lighter, and those lighter objects look physiologically lighter as if you can lift them more easily. And if you can lift something more easily, then that object is typically smaller. Therefore, transparent buttons are more motivating because they provide the feeling of a smaller magnitude, and we misattribute that smaller magnitude with, again, a smaller abstract magnitude behind that button. So whatever action lies behind that button, we conceptualize it as a smaller and more doable step, and so we're more likely to click that transparent button. Visual design is incredibly powerful at influencing our perception and behavior. If you want to learn many other interesting principles that influence our buying behavior, I have a lot of other videos outside of YouTube. You can just go to schoolofmind.com and you'll see a vast array of videos that explore these topics in more detail. So I'll see you there.